Hey there and welcome to the Weaver's World. This video is the third in a series about how I write my own adventures, but don't let that fool you. I'll use this process as an example to teach you how to write better adventures as well. Last time we went over how to incorporate danger into our adventure, as well as how to make our dungeon feel more alive, as it were. This time we will focus on one particular aspect of danger. That's right, it's time for combat. But not just boring back and forth poking, stabbing and screaming. I'm talking about combat that makes your players hang at the edge of their seats. And before we start, if you found this video helpful, consider leaving a comment or a like. That also goes for if you want to help me out. It really does. But that's the last you'll hear about that in this video. Let's go. Many rulebooks offer ways of building an encounter. Dungeons & Dragons uses a certain formula to calculate how strong an encounter should be to give your group either a mild challenge, a serious challenge, or actually almost kill them. There are a lot of videos out there discussing how valid this approach is, and I won't add to that discussion, at least for now. Maybe some other time. What I want to focus on in this part is a much more basic question. What will your group actually be fighting? Not as in how hard will that encounter be, but why are they fighting these enemies exactly? Orcs just showing up out of nowhere and fighting to the death without proper motivation gets old pretty fast. Not to say it reinforces some really idiotic stereotypes. So let's go about that first, shall we? When people choose to fight, that usually means that every other option is off the table. The same usually goes for wild creatures, unless of course they are either enchanted or hungry. And we could argue that the last case really just reinforces my point. They either eat, now, or they die. So not only do your enemies need a reason to be in the same area as your group, they also need a reason to attack them. This can of course be really simple, like hungry animals or bandits motivated by greed, but in that case they will most likely surrender as soon as they see that what they try to do doesn't work. And let's be honest here, what bandit in their right mind would attack a group that looks like they kill dragons for sport? So let the enemies flee once it's clear they are outmatched. More intelligent creatures might even try to negotiate with your players so as to make it out alive, while animals mostly just run away as soon as they realize their prey is more capable than they anticipated. This simple detail often gets overlooked, and that makes many tabletop sessions feel more like video games than they actually should. But let's say you do want to fight to the death with some wild animals. In that case, we need a good reason for them not to flee the second they realize that the cost far outweighs the benefits. They could already be fleeing for once. Whatever they are running from, it is so fearsome, at least to them, that they will just attack anything that's in their way in a blind frenzy. Fleeing is one of the major instincts most animals have, so that is not too far off. On the other hand, sentient creatures are not as likely to fight as they flee. They would most likely avoid any obstacles rather than fight them, but they might have other reasons to fight to the death. In our adventure, set in a temple deep inside the forest, fanatic cultists would fit this bill nicely. They might be willing to defend their religion, even to the death, if necessary. With these two examples, I'm sure you can think of more, but I personally would not condone giving your players combat after combat to the death. Let their enemies flee, or at least try to. If your players want to kill them even then, that's their decision to make, but most living things only throw themselves in the proverbial meat grinder when they have absolutely no other choice. As for magical creatures like golems, gargoyles or similar things, go for it. Depending on how you handle the afterlife in your game, ghosts, zombies and similar undeath dangers are fair game as well. Naturally, not every combat needs to have the goal of killing your players. Sometimes there are other reasons to engage someone in combat, but I'll get to that later in the video. Let's just keep that in mind for now. Combat doesn't happen on a blank sheet of paper. Initially it does, but this sheet of paper later on becomes a forgotten crypt, a dense forest, or maybe a rowdy tavern. With that, the environment suddenly becomes a very important factor. A crypt has old, heavy statues standing around, there is thick canopy and roots in the forest, and in a tavern, there's so much stuff begging to be thrown around, destroyed, or used as an improvised weapon. Visual storytelling is perhaps one of the most underappreciated parts of writing and running an adventure. The enemies don't simply approach your players, they sneak through the forest, make a show in a tavern, or race out of their graves, weapons in hand, to fight once more. And they can use their environment as well. If you want to see how this can be done, Jackie Chan movies are a great example. There is a narrative technique, often called Chekhov's gun, meaning that if something is part of the scene, it has to be used in some way. And akin to that, there's Jackie's ladder, fridge, bicycle, you name it. This lends itself well to a monk, for instance, but even if we ignore elements you can use in combat, the environment is just as important for the terrain it offers. In some systems, magic can be used to alter the combat situation, with plants suddenly growing or terrain becoming impossible to traverse. Stairs and ladders are excellent opportunities to play with movement, and the weather is a good way to play as well. A thunderstorm or hail are dramatic in themselves already, but pair that with the limited visibility and potential hindrances like wet or slippery floors they create, and suddenly the whole combat situation changes from what it was mere seconds ago. Your players will use tactics and strategy, at least hopefully, so their enemies should be able to do the same, especially if they get to prepare an ambush. Have them hide behind trees or under tables. Let them use the high ground should they have it. On that note, tabletop games are not MMORPGs, so unless your system has a mechanic to emulate this, the enemies should not simply focus on the person drawing the aggro. More likely, they will notice the lesser armored characters trying to stay out of their sightline and focus them specifically. Allow yourself to be creative with where the fight takes place, as well as why it takes place, to determine the strategies of your players' enemies. This also goes hand in hand with their motivation, as mentioned beforehand. Should they fight to kill, they will use anything at their disposal to do so. They could throw over heavy statues to bury your players under them, hit them with volleys of arrows from far above. Should they stall for time, they will not necessarily attack, but fall back every now and again, provoking the players just enough to keep the fight going. Maybe they are waiting for reinforcements to arrive, or the ritual further down the hall to finish. All that can influence the enemy's strategy. So, after a lot of theory, how do we go about our little adventure here? I just want to give you 2 examples for combat. Again, I'll try to stay system agnostic here, so let's just think about the very basics of combat and apply what we've learned so far. The first encounter is more meant as a brief exercise to familiarize newer players with the system, as well as just have some flavor for the journey ahead. In this case, they stumble upon some wild animals in the forest who have been stirred up by something further ahead. Maybe the temple the players head to is not as abandoned as they thought, and something is disturbing the wildlife enough to trigger their flight reflex. And with the players being in the way, they will try to get through by force. So either the players move out of the way or fight. The beasts will not fight to the death, obviously, and rather retreat to find a different route once a few of them die. Still, it might be enough to get the players thinking, as well as ready for further battles up ahead. On this map, we have a lot of obstacles like broken pews, rubble and trees. I'm imagining that there's probably a cult down there praying to the god this temple was originally built for. They are fanatics to the core and would rather die than betray their god, and their goal is to keep the players from going any further. So they'll barricade themselves in the temple, using the pews and walls to create bottlenecks they can use against the players. Maybe they want to simply knock them out to sacrifice them later, in which case they will use non-lethal weapons. Otherwise, they might well have booby-trapped some of the pillars or important locations, which they will use against the players, for example by guiding them into going to certain places in order to let them activate the traps. The sky is the limit here, and I'm sure you can think of plenty other examples yourself. To sum it up, combat is more than just trading rolls back and forth. Every combat happens for a reason and in a certain environment. Both are factors that influence what happens as well as how everyone will behave. Encourage your players to be creative with their surroundings, as well as being creative yourself. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Your creativity is a muscle, and the more you use it, the more it will grow. Just allow yourself to have fun while you are doing it. Next time, we will talk more about individualizing the plot for your players, as well as how to make a memorable final encounter, which doesn't necessarily have to be combat. But more on that in the next episode. Until then, see you soon.